November 11th, 1943. 0530 hours. Bougainville Island, Solomon Islands. The jungle did not just sleep. It waited. A heavy, suffocating mist clung to the perimeter of the 3rd Marine Division's forward positions at Empress Augusta Bay, smelling of wet rot and ozone. In the gray pre-dawn light, the war felt paused, suspended in the sticky heat of the South Pacific. Deep within a concealed foxhole, Staff Sergeant Thomas Michael Callahan lay motionless, his body pressed into the damp earth, becoming part of the landscape. His cheek rested against the cool, polished stock of his Springfield M1903 rifle, his right eye fused to the unertolate power scope. He was a statue of lethal intent, his heart rate deliberately slowed, his breathing shallow. In his left hand, however, he held an object that defied all military logic. It was not a grenade, a map, or a weapon at least, not in the conventional sense. It was a Campbell's chicken noodle soup can, dented, rusted, with both ends jaggedly removed and a crude hole punched in the side. It looked like garbage. To any passing officer, it would have appeared to be the detritus of a bored soldier. But to Callahan, this piece of discarded tin was the triggering mechanism for a trap that was about to rewrite the rules of engagement. Through his scope, Callahan scanned the Japanese lines, 700 yards away across a killing ground cleared of heavy brush. The enemy was dug in deep, invisible behind layers of palm logs and sandbags. Direct assault against them was suicide. Standard counter-sniping was a guessing game. Callahan needed them to show themselves. He needed them curious. 15 yards to his left, a similar soup can sat atop a bamboo stick driven into the mud. Callahan had spent the previous night calculating the geometry of the dawn with mathematical precision. He was not just predicting the enemy. He was predicting the sun. At 0547, the jungle floor shifted from gray to gold. The first aggressive ray of the morning sun pierced the canopy and struck the soup can. The effect was instantaneous. A brilliant, concentrated diamond of reflected light shot across the jungle clearing. It was not a random glint. It was a directed beam, aimed precisely at a cluster of palm fronds suspected of concealing a Japanese observation post. For exactly 2 seconds, the reflection burned steady, an unnatural star in the dark green void. Then, Callahan reached out with a long stick and nudged his can just an inch. The light beam danced. 700 yards away, the trap sprung. The human brain is hardwired to detect anomalies: movement, flash, contrast. A Japanese observer, disciplined and hardened by years of war, let his curiosity override his training. The flashing light was too rhythmic to be nature, too bright to be ignored. He shifted his position to investigate the strange phenomenon, his helmet rising just inches above the safety of his sandbag parapet. He needed to see. He exposed his head for 3 seconds. Callahan Springfield spoke once. The crack of the rifle was swallowed immediately by the dense foliage, but the result was final. The observer fell back into his pit, darkness claiming him before he ever understood he had been killed by a reflection. This was the first kill of what military historians would later classify as the most devastating 5 days in Pacific sniper warfare. Before the week was out, Sergeant Callahan would use variations of his soup can trick to eliminate 112 confirmed enemy combatants. He would drive an entire Japanese regiment into tactical paralysis, creating a ghost that was everywhere and nowhere. What began as a desperate improvisation born from empty ration tins would transform into a systematic killing method that the Imperial Japanese Army had no tactical answer for. The mathematics of death were being rewritten, not through superior firepower or overwhelming numbers, but through human ingenuity applied to discarded trash. The road to the suffocating jungles of Bougainville began 6 months earlier and 5,000 miles away, in the cool, pine-scented air of Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. But for Thomas Callahan, the real training had started much earlier, on the rugged slopes of the Bitterroot Mountains in rural Montana. Callahan was a farm boy, enlisted in 1941 at age 19, fueled by the rage that swept the nation after Pearl Harbor. But unlike the city kids who learned to shoot on flat ranges with painted targets, Callahan had learned the art of the rifle in the wild. Hunting mule deer and elk had drilled into him an instinctive understanding of ballistics that no field manual could replicate. He knew how wind curved around a valley, how humidity affected a bullet's flight, and most importantly, he understood the crushing weight of patience. His company commander, Captain Harold Morrison, first noticed this uncanny talent during a routine rifle qualification in March 1943. While other Marines fired with mechanical rhythm, Callahan was a study in hesitation. He took an extra 15 seconds before each shot, his eyes scanning the swaying grass downrange, compensating for a crosswind that most shooters did not even feel. He scored 48 out of 50 at 300 yards with iron sights. Morrison had pulled him aside, the smell of gunpowder hanging between them. "You hunt before the war, Private. Elk mostly, sir." "Some deer." "How far?" 700 yards with my daddies." 3006. Iron sights. 3 days later, Callahan was on a train to scout sniper school at Camp Pendleton, California. The program in 1943 was a brutal evolution of warfare, emphasizing intelligence gathering and psychological terror over pure marksmanship. Gunnery Sergeant William Henderson, a man who seemed carved from granite, taught the psychology module. "Killing the enemy is the last resort," Henderson told the class, his voice low and dangerous. "Your job is intelligence. You watch, you report. But when you do shoot, you make it count. You do not just eliminate a target. You shoot to create maximum psychological impact on the survivors. You make them afraid to breathe." Callahan excelled. He understood that in the wild, an elk could stand motionless for hours, effectively invisible, only to vanish at the slightest unnatural movement. He applied this hunter's logic to his stalking exercises, culminating in a final exam where he stalked within 200 yards of instructors using high-powered binoculars. They never saw him until he stood up and waved. Henderson's parting advice would haunt him later. "You are good, Callahan, but you are thinking like a hunter. The Japs are not elk. They adapt. They learn patterns. The sniper who survives is not the best shot. It is the one who never does the same thing twice." Callahan deployed to the South Pacific in July 1943, assigned to the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marine Division. The landing at Empress Augusta Bay on November 1st was a chaotic symphony of violence involving 14,000 Marines. By November 3rd, the perimeter was established. But the real war, the silent war, began a week later. On November 8th, the theoretical lessons of Camp Pendleton collided with the bloody reality of the jungle. Callahan was conducting reconnaissance with his spotter and close friend, Corporal James Rivera. Rivera, a sharp-eyed kid from the Bronx, made a fatal, rookie mistake. Trying to identify a distant movement, he raised his binoculars, the sun glinting off the glass for just 3 seconds. A Japanese sniper, concealed on a tree platform 600 yards away, did not hesitate. The shot was perfect. Rivera collapsed, dead before he hit the ground. Callahan spent the next 30 minutes lying completely motionless next to his friend's body, processing a volatile cocktail of grief and cold rage. He studied the jungle, analyzing the angles. He did not fire back blindly. He did not call for mortar support. Instead, he analyzed the enemy's position. The Japanese sniper was a master of concealment. Direct assault was suicide. Callahan dragged Rivera's body back to friendly lines, his face a mask of stone. He requested permission to hunt the Japanese sniper who killed his friend, but not with the standard counter-sniper team. He needed to force a master of camouflage to reveal himself. He needed to turn the enemy's discipline into their downfall. That night, the jungle was a wall of black noise, the screech of insects and the distant rumble of thunder masking the sounds of infiltration. Callahan sat deep in his foxhole, the damp earth smelling of grave dirt. He was heating his evening sea ration, a tin of Campbell's chicken noodle soup, over the small, hissing blue flame of a fuel tablet. He was not hungry. Grief left a metallic taste in his mouth, but the body needed fuel. He opened the can with his P38 opener, the small click, click, click sounding dangerously loud in the silence. As he peeled back the jagged lid, it caught the last dying embers of the fuel tablet's flame. A brilliant, concentrated flare of light, slashed across the dark walls of the foxhole, momentarily blinding him. Callahan froze. He stared at the can, then at the oppressive darkness of the jungle, and then back at the can. The connection fired in his brain with the force of a physical blow. The Japanese sniper who had killed Rivera was disciplined, patient, and invisible. He would not fall for a helmet on a stick that was a trick for amateurs. But light was primal. Light implied technology, signaling, communication. It demanded attention. 15 minutes later, he was standing before Captain Morrison in the command bunker, the empty soup can still in his hand. "You want to use garbage as bait?" Morrison asked, rubbing eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. "Not bait, sir. Distraction." "Confusion," Callahan corrected, his voice flat and certain. "The Japs are trained to spot rhythm. Movement. Muzzle flash. They do not train for random light reflections. It breaks their pattern. If I can make them curious, they will shift position to investigate. That is when I shoot." Morrison looked at the dented can, then at Callahan's grim face. "You would need a pattern. Something they can't ignore. I will give them a show, sir." Morrison approved the mission. It was a desperate gamble to reduce the casualty rate, born of the realization that standard tactics were failing. November 9th marked the first operational test. Under the cover of pre-dawn darkness, Callahan crawled into no man's land, his heart hammering against his ribs. He spent 2 agonizing hours planting 5 soup cans on bamboo stakes at various intervals, creating a killing fan. Each can was rigged with a simple but ingenious system of fishing line and pulleys, allowing him to adjust their angle from 300 yards away. At 0615, the sun breached the horizon. The jungle steamed. Callahan, concealed in a dense thicket of fern, began his work. He pulled the first string. The can on the far left tilted, catching the morning sun and throwing a harsh beam of light into the enemy tree line. Flash. 3 seconds. Darkness. 30 seconds later, he pulled the second string. Another flash, from a different angle. For 20 minutes, the jungle remained silent. Doubt began to creep in. Maybe Henderson was right. Maybe they were too smart. But then, the psychological trap snapped shut. A Japanese soldier, driven by the need to identify the source of these rhythmic signals, emerged partially from the treeline. He was not careless. He was doing his job. He assumed American forces were using mirrors for tactical communication, a high-value target. Through the unertl scope, Callahan watched the soldier raise his binoculars. The enemy was focused entirely on the flashing can, his peripheral vision narrowed by the task. Callahan exhaled, the crosshairs settling over the soldier's chest at 480 yards. The recoil punched Callahan's shoulder. The Japanese soldier crumpled, the binoculars flying from his hands. Callahan did not celebrate. He immediately collapsed his position and sprinted 300 yards south, moving through the undergrowth like a ghost. He knew what was coming. 30 minutes later, Japanese mortar fire screamed out of the sky, pulverizing the area where Callahan had just been. Over 50 rounds churned the earth, destroying ferns and trees, but hitting nothing but empty air. That afternoon, Callahan refined his instrument. He punched small holes in the cans to create starburst patterns. He smeared mud on some surfaces to dull the reflection, making others appear brighter by contrast. He was no longer just a sniper. He was a puppeteer of light, and the enemy was dancing on his strings. November 11th brought the encounter that would define the entire operation, a silent, lethal chess match played out across a humid valley of death. By now, Callahan had identified a specific Japanese position that haunted the Marine lines. It was a large, ancient banyan tree, strangled by vines and perched on a ridge approximately 700 yards east. This was not just another machine gun nest. It was the lair of a predator. The sniper operating from that tree was exceptional, likely the same man who had killed Corporal Rivera. He possessed perfect fire discipline, never firing twice from the same aperture, and he moved between 3 distinct firing platforms concealed within the massive root system of the single tree. Standard counter-sniper efforts had failed repeatedly, but more worryingly, this sniper had stopped responding to the soup cans. He had seen the random flashing lights on November 9th and 10th, and had correctly deduced they were a trap. He was learning. Callahan realized that to kill a master, he had to offer a target too valuable to ignore. Random curiosity would not work. He needed to trigger the enemy's tactical duty. The Japanese sniper was an intelligence gatherer. He would not shoot at a reflection, but he would be obligated to disrupt a command structure. Callahan devised what he called the command post gambit. It was no longer just a sniper mission. It was theater. He positioned his soup cans not to flash randomly, but to mimic the rhythmic, staccato flashes of an American signal lamp sending Morse code. But the lights were just the backdrop. Callahan recruited his security team to become actors in a deadly play. He had to move conspicuously in a clearing 500 yards behind the lights, carrying large rectangular objects that looked like map cases and radio equipment. They pointed at the ridge. They passed documents back and forth. To the naked eye, it looked like a forward command post coordinating a major offensive. From the Japanese perspective, this was an intelligence gold mine. A high-ranking officer coordinating an attack from forward position was a target that justified the risk of exposure. Callahan positioned himself 500 yards north of this fake command post, establishing a perfect 90-degree flank angle to the suspected banyan tree. He lay in the mud, sweat stinging his eyes, his heart rate forcibly slowed to a crawl. At 0930, the curtain rose. The security team pantomimed a heated strategic discussion. The soup cans flashed their nonsense Morse code. For 90 minutes, nothing happened. The heat was oppressive, a physical weight pressing down on the jungle. Callahan did not blink. He knew his enemy was watching, calculating, waiting for the officer to stand still. Then, at 11:15, the jungle betrayed its secret. A single branch on the banyan tree shifted against the wind. It was a micro-movement, invisible to the untrained eye. But to a hunter who had tracked elk through the Bitterroot winters, it was a scream. Through his 8-power scope, Callahan dissected the tree. At 11:23, he found it a small opening in the dense foliage, no wider than a dinner plate. As he watched, the hole darkened. Someone had moved into position behind it. The range was 712 yards. The wind was drifting lazily from the southeast at 8 miles per hour. Callahan's mind became a biological computer. Hold 2 feet right. Aim 30 inches high. At 11:27, the black steel of a rifle barrel slid through the foliage. Just 6 inches of metal, but it was enough. The Japanese sniper was settling his aim on the officer in the clearing. He was seconds away from firing. Callahan did not wait. He squeezed the trigger between heartbeats. The .30-06 round arced through the heavy air, a supersonic messenger of vengeance. It took approximately 2 seconds to cross the valley. Callahan did not see the impact, but he saw the result. The rifle barrel in the tree jerked violently upward, then dropped. A moment later, a body crashed through the canopy, breaking through the lower platforms before hitting the jungle floor with the final dull thud. When Marines swept the position hours later, they found a logbook on the body of a Japanese sergeant. It documented 53 American casualties over 3 months. The command post gambit had ended the reign of the sector's most dangerous operator, proving that in this new war, the best weapon was not the rifle, it was the story you told the enemy before you pulled the trigger. November 11th ended with a significant victory, but the morning of November 12th brought a dangerous silence. The Japanese forces, having lost their primary sniper and several scouts to mysterious circumstances, adjusted their tactics with terrifying speed. They stopped biting. The enemy commanders issued strict orders: ignore the lights. They pulled back their sentries and enforced rigid fire discipline. They realized that curiosity was killing them, so they chose blindness. Callahan, watching from his perch, saw the change immediately. The single flashes that had worked 2 days ago were now being studiously ignored. He had forced them to adapt, and in doing so, he had rendered his original trick obsolete. The game had to evolve. If the Japanese would not investigate a curiosity, Callahan had to manufacture a crisis. He spent the pre-dawn hours of November 12th deploying 8 soup cans, a significant escalation from his usual 5. But it was the arrangement that mattered. He did not position them for random flashes. He set them up to create a signal network. By pulling his strings in a complex sequence, he created a ripple of light that moved from the rear lines toward the front, and then back again. To a Japanese observer, this was not just a reflection. This looked like a coordinated relay of signals between multiple American platoons. It suggested a massive troop movement, a shifting of heavy assets that usually preceded a dawn assault. This was not something they could afford to ignore. It was tactical data. The deception worked. The Japanese, desperate to understand American intentions, were forced to send out reconnaissance patrols to verify the troop movements. Major Takeshi Yamamoto, the Japanese battalion commander facing Callahan's sector, was losing his grip on the battlefield. His war diary, captured days later, revealed the depth of the confusion. Enemy employs unknown signaling methods. Attempts to locate signal sources result in immediate casualties. Sniper fire of exceptional accuracy eliminates our observers. I am unable to determine if signals are genuine tactical communication or deception. The men are speaking of spirits. Morale is declining. By midday, Callahan had achieved 16 confirmed kills. But the psychological impact was far greater than the body count. The Japanese soldiers were becoming paranoid. Every glint of sunlight on a wet leaf, every flash of a bird's wing, became a potential death sentence. They were fighting a ghost that wielded light as a weapon. Then the weather turned. On November 15th, heavy, bruising clouds rolled in off the ocean, obscuring the sun and eliminating the primary mechanism of the soup-can technique. The jungle turned gray and sullen. Without the sun, there were no reflections. The stage was dark. But Callahan had anticipated the failure of his primary weapon. If he could not use their eyes, he would use their ears. Marine supply had provided him with empty 50 caliber ammunition, cans, heavy steel boxes, far more resonant than soup tins. Under the cover of the storm's noise, he positioned these cans in dense brush and hollow logs, filling them with handfuls of dry pebbles. He rigged them with his signature string systems. When the rain lulled, Callahan pulled a string. The pebbles rattled inside the steel can. Clack, clack, clatter. It did not sound like nature. It sounded like the metallic racking of a machine gun bolt, or the careless movement of equipment. It was the sound of a clumsy American soldier setting up a heavy weapon. The Japanese, blinded by the gloom, were forced to rely on sound. When they heard the distinct metallic rattle of equipment being moved near their flank, they had to react. They sent a patrol to ambush the careless Americans. They found only empty cans and Callahan's waiting crosshairs. By turning their own vigilance against them, Callahan proved that the method did not matter light, sound, or movement. The weapon was the mind. He had trapped them in a loop where every instinct for self-preservation led directly to their destruction. November 14th marked the crescendo of violence, a day where the line between warfare and slaughter blurred entirely. It was the day the ghost of Bougainville stopped being a nuisance and became a strategic catastrophe for the Imperial Japanese Army. Callahan had reached the zenith of his craft. He now controlled a network of over 20 soup cans and sound decoys spread across a half-mile front. His security team moved with the synchronized precision of a pit crew, adjusting angles and pulling strings to create a symphony of false information. The crowning achievement of the operation came at 1,430 hours. Callahan did not just simulate a patrol or a command post. He simulated an invasion. He positioned his cans to create a frantic, overlapping pattern of signals that suggested a massive American assault force was massing for a push against the Japanese right flank. The deception was so convincing that the Japanese commanders, terrified of being overrun, ordered a frantic repositioning of their defensive line. Panic is the enemy of cover. To move an entire company requires coordination, and coordination requires visibility. Officers stood up to shout orders. NCOs ran across open ground to rally their squads. They believed they were reacting to an imminent offensive. Instead, they were running into a shooting gallery. For 90 minutes, Callahan and his security team engaged targets of opportunity with devastating rhythm. It was a massacre of the curious and the confused. 11 Japanese soldiers fell in that single engagement, including 2 officers whose deaths severed the chain of command, plunging the sector into leaderless chaos. By the time the sun set on November 14th, Callahan had logged 31 confirmed kills in a single day. The Japanese regiment facing them was not just defeated. It was paralyzed. A captured intelligence report later revealed the extent of the breakdown. It described an enemy force that refused to move, refused to scout, and refused to believe their own eyes. They were trapped in a cage of their own fear, terrified that even the sunlight was conspiring to kill them. On the evening of November 15th, Lieutenant Colonel Michael O'Brien summoned Callahan to the battalion bunker. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of wet canvas. O'Brien looked at the dirty, exhausted sergeant standing before him. "Your 5 days are up, Callahan," O'Brien said, glancing at a sheet of paper on his desk. "The current count is 112 confirmed kills. Secondary observers have verified 97 of them. That is not just effective, son. That is industrial." The intelligence assessment filed the next day, November 16th, was clinical in its language, but revolutionary in its implications. It estimated that Callahan had wasted over 300 enemy man-hours investigating false signatures and had degraded their intelligence gathering capability by 70%. But the most telling line was in the recommendation: methodology merits immediate documentation for potential wider implementation. Recommend Sergeant Callahan be reassigned to training duties. The technique is too valuable to risk losing the teacher. Across the lines, the story was ending in tragedy. Major Yamamoto, the Japanese commander who had watched his battalion disintegrate, made his final diary entry 3 days before his own death. It was a lament for a lost kind of warfare. The American demon sniper has destroyed us. Officers are afraid to expose themselves. Soldiers refuse reconnaissance. We cannot maintain a defensive posture when we cannot trust the light. I no longer know what is real. Callahan withdrew from the front lines on November 16th. He left behind a battered stretch of jungle and a pile of rusted cans, but he took with him a new doctrine. He had proven that you could break an army without firing a mortar. You just had to break their minds first. Thomas Callahan spent 2 weeks recovering at a rear area base, the adrenaline of the hunt slowly replaced by the gray fatigue of combat exhaustion. While his body healed, his mind was put to work. At the urgent request of Marine Corps headquarters, he sat at a rickety wooden desk and wrote a detailed after-action report. Titled Employment of Improvised Deception Devices in Counter-Sniper Operations, it became the founding document of modern deceptive warfare. In his report, Callahan wrote a sentence that is still quoted in sniper schools today. The Soupkin technique succeeds not because it defeats the enemy's equipment, but because it exploits their training. We force them to make a choice: ignore a potential threat and die, or investigate it and die. Once you control their choices, you own the battlefield. By January 1944, the Callahan method had spread across the Pacific like a virus. The improvised soup cans became so legendary that Marine supply officers began issuing polished metal mirror plates specifically designed for the task. The raw ingenuity of a farm boy had been industrialized, becoming standard issue for scout sniper teams from Saipan to Okinawa. Callahan never returned to the front lines as a shooter. The Marine Corps, recognizing that his brain was more valuable than his trigger finger, reassigned him to Camp Pendleton as a lead instructor. For the remainder of the war, he trained over 400 snipers. He did not just teach them to shoot. He taught them to think. He would hold up a rifle and tell his students, "This is just a tool. Your real weapon is your creativity. If you find yourself in a fair fight, you did not plan it well enough." Post-war analysis by military historians confirmed the magnitude of his achievement. While the Battle of Bougainville was decided by thousands of men, Callahan's 5-day operation was unique. He proved that a single soldier, using nothing but refuse and intellect, could degrade an entire enemy regiment's effectiveness. Japanese training manuals captured in 1945 showed specifically drafted countermeasures for light deception, validating that Callahan had forced an entire army to rewrite its doctrine. Thomas Callahan survived the war without a physical scratch, but he carried the weight of 112 lives with quiet dignity. He returned to Montana, hanging up his uniform to become a high school history teacher and football coach. He rarely spoke of the war. When he did, it was not to brag. In a rare 1978 interview, when asked if he was proud of his record, he paused for a long time before answering. "I am proud we won," he said softly. "I am proud I helped Marines come home. But I am not proud of the killing. Necessary does not mean proud. It just means necessary." Callahan passed away in May 2003. Today, in the quiet, hallowed halls of the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Triangle, Virginia, you can find a glass display case that stops visitors in their tracks. Inside rests a weathered Springfield M1903 rifle, the wood worn smooth by jungle humidity and sweat. Next to it, sitting on a small pedestal, are 3 rusted, dented soup cans. The placard reads, "These ordinary objects, transformed by extraordinary thinking, represent the innovative spirit that defined American fighting forces in World War II." The jungle has long since reclaimed the foxholes of Bougainville. The noise of the battle is gone, replaced by the timeless hum of the insects. But the lesson remains. In an era of drones, satellites, and smart weapons, the story of the soup can sniper is a stark reminder that the ultimate weapon is, and always will be, the human mind. Technology amplifies capability, but creativity defines possibility. Thomas Callahan proved that you can change the course of a battle with nothing more than a rusted can and the will to try something crazy. That is how you win wars, not just with bigger guns, but with better thinking.